Across much of the world today, leaders both left and right of centre have abysmal approval ratings. Biden left office with 36%, Macron sits in the mid-20s, Scholz managed its 20% before his government collapsed, and yet Vladimir Putin, a man universally condemned by the international community for his authoritarian rule, is sitting at north of 80% after being in power for 25 years and the disastrous war in Ukraine. For over 2 decades, Putin has perfected a political formula that transforms every crisis into an opportunity for popularity gains, every sanction into proof of Western hostility, and every military adventure into a patriotic triumph. He's got here by building what seems like an indestructible political machine, powered by a potent mix of economic modernization, nationalist pride, and systematic elimination of political opposition. Understanding Putin's genuine popularity matters because it reveals how authoritarianism can work. It doesn't have to be exclusively about repression and propaganda, though he's brought plenty of both of those to the table. It's about creating a system where political loyalty is not enforced through Stalinist-era forced devotion, but through making the leader inseparable from patriotism itself. In such a system, opposing him is not just opposing the president, it's opposing Russian identity itself. This is the story of how Putin built the most durable authoritarian popularity in recent history and why, increasingly, it might not be enough to see him through. Now, in order to understand how Putin got to where he is today, you first need to grasp the sheer economic and psychological devastation that Russians experienced after the fall of the Soviet Union. The numbers tell an absolutely stunning story of near civilizational collapse. Russia's GDP fell by nearly half in a matter of years, a contraction worse than the United States in the Great Depression. Hyperinflation in the early 90s hit an eye-watering, wait for it, 2,000%, wiping out the life savings of millions overnight. The income side of things was not much better. Real wages collapsed on average by 2/3, pushing millions more people into poverty. Now, let's make something clear. The Soviet economy was never a paradise. While the final decades didn't see the same mass starvation that were features of the earlier years, there were nevertheless chronic shortages, long queues for things as simple as bread, and stagnation was endemic. But it was stable. People had jobs. Food wasn't abundant, but it was available. The 90s absolutely obliterated all of this, as the economy had for decades rested on massive state subsidies that made the country extremely uncompetitive. Without such subsidization, the whole thing came crashing down. This economic devastation was second only to the psychological impact. The Soviet Union had, for nearly a century, been one of the two great powers, dominating the Eastern Bloc and being the only serious military rival to the United States. Its influence spans the world, from Havana, just miles off the coast of Florida, to Vietnam in Eastern Asia. Whenever the space race was mentioned, Russians were quick to insert that they had been the first to put a man into orbit. Now, to be clear, Russia wasn't alone in suffering through this post-Soviet transition. Ukraine went through an equally devastating collapse, which saw its GDP fall by roughly 60% throughout the decade, resulting in high unemployment and food scarcity for many. Other Eastern and Central European countries, from the Baltics through to Czechoslovakia, were not spared from the impacts of this, although Central Europe bounced back much faster. Regardless, all this is to say that authoritarianism was never inevitable nor the only solution. Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and others managed to emerge from this collapse as functioning democracies and today have healthier economies than Russia. Poland tripled its GDP, while the standard of living has shot up dramatically through Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Nevertheless, Russia decided to forge its own path, one that was paved by a man that you are also very well familiar with, Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin first entered the public light in 1999 as the country's new prime minister, hand-chosen by Yeltsin. He was a political nobody at the time, the mid-level bureaucrat with a background in intelligence work who'd spent the last decade in the St. Petersburg mayor's office handling foreign business relations. Before that, he served 16 years in the KGB, including a posting in Dresden that ended with him burning intelligence files as the Berlin Wall fell. This wasn't the profile of an up-and-coming political star, nor that of a reformer. The KGB may have been many things, but Liberal Democrats, they were not. To his credit, though, Putin read the scene better than most Western observers believed he could have. Fixing the country's economy had to be the first priority, and it had to be done at all costs. His early years, during which he built up his support, stand in contrast to the way the same man is currently running the country. He surrounded himself with a team of Western-trained economists who were, above all else, really boring. They weren't climbing tanks like Yeltsin or calling for the renationalization of broad swaths of the economy like their holdover communists. Their mandate was simple: stabilize the economy, then get it growing. Key figures included Alexei Kudrin as finance minister and German Gref as economic development minister, both trained in Western economic theory and committed to market reform and modernizing Russia's ailing economy. They implemented a flat 13% income tax that dramatically increased revenue by making tax evasion less attractive, created a stabilization fund from oil revenues to cushion against price shocks, and perhaps most importantly, enshrined property rights. The USSR hadn't exactly been a bastion of private property ownership, but the 90s was an absolute mess. Who really owned a factory, for example? The state, the workers, the oligarch who bought it? Putin's team put together a legal framework that, while far from perfect, gave businesses and investors some confidence that their assets just wouldn't be arbitrarily seized. The 2002 Land Code finally allowed private ownership of land for the first time since the Bolshevik Revolution nearly a century prior. They weren't the most glamorous or revolutionary of reforms, but they were milestones in moving towards a functioning market economy. The results were genuinely impressive. Real wages more than tripled between 2000 and 2008. GDP growth exceeded 7% annually, making Russia one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. Industrial production rose by over 75% during Putin's first 8 years. The poverty rate dropped from 30% to 11%. Consumer credit became available for the first time in the country. While its leaders do deserve some credit for the successful economic recovery, they weren't performing miracles. Much of this came from oil prices nearly quadrupling from $25 to over $100 per barrel during this period. Even Venezuela, one of the most corrupt and ineffectively run economies in the world, managed to stabilize itself to an extent during this period thanks to the high price of oil. While this did create a dependency on oil prices and sales, this was a trivial detail to many Russian citizens. And we can hardly blame them, can we? Their country was emerging from a decade of disaster and seeing genuine growth and stabilization. For many, Putin became nothing short of a hero. The years of disaster in the 90s were over, and a new government that was uncharacteristically competent was here. State media worked overtime to back this up too. They made sure Putin got credit for every positive development, while problems were either dismissed or blamed on local officials or foreign meddling. Amidst all of this, Russia looked to many as though it was finally turning a corner and leaving its isolationist era behind by engaging with the broader international community. Foreign investment began to come into the country as the Russian financial sector began to be seen as increasingly stable and profitable. International companies opened their offices in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Between 2000 and 2008, foreign direct investment increased from $2.7 billion to $75 billion annually. BP alone invested $8 billion in the Russian oil company TNK. German companies from Siemens to Metro opened major operation facilities. They even began paying down the country's crushing foreign debts, namely to the International Monetary Fund that it had borrowed from as a lender of last resort during the turmoil of the 90s. By 2006, this debt was paid off entirely and ahead of schedule. Very few countries are able to transform themselves as fast as this. And in this era, it was easy to be lulled into this false sense of optimism. George W. Bush famously said he, quote, looked into Putin's soul in 2001 and found him trustworthy. Okay. German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, while negotiating the construction of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, called Putin a, wait for it, flawless Democrat. Even after Russia's 2008 invasion of Georgia, Chancellor Merkel pushed ahead with further construction projects, most controversially Nord Stream 2, integrating Russia's energy production into European markets. Yet there were early warning signs for those who looked. Independent television network NTV was seized by the state in 2001 after criticizing the Chechen War. Journalists investigating the 1999 apartment bombings that launched the war and therefore Putin's rise to power began dying under mysterious circumstances. Anna Politkovskaya was shot in her apartment building and Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium in London. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man, was arrested in 2003 essentially for funding opposition parties. For anyone who cared to look, the message was there. Political freedom was not around the corner. After the collapse of the Soviet system, Russia was simply transferring to a whole new style of autocracy. Russia's economic turnaround and Putin's resulting soaring popularity, that wasn't a one-off. Putin's political genius lies in converting every crisis into an opportunity to score domestic popularity gains, and it's been quite consistent through the years. Identify a threat, project strength, claim victory, and watch as approval soars. This formula dates back to even prior to his presidency. In September 1999, a series of apartment bombings killed over 300 Russians in cities ranging from Moscow to Bryansk to Volgodonsk. This was adding insult to injury. On top of all the crises the country was facing economically, it looked to both their citizens as well as the international community as though they couldn't secure their own capital. Putin wasted little time here, promising to waste the terrorists in the outhouse. Crude, certainly, but it resounded. He recognized the country was going through a period of weakness unprecedented in living memory and figured he knew exactly what would rally the nationalist sentiment at home. The official story was Chechen separatists were responsible for the apartment bombings, a narrative that gave Putin the perfect justification for military action. Within weeks, he had launched the Second Chechen War, in which he, not the sitting president, was shown as leading the military to victory. The media coverage was extensive and carefully choreographed. Cameras followed Putin around throughout the entire conflict, showing him inspecting troops and studying battlefield maps, portraying him as studying hard and making the tough decisions under pressure. The president at the time, Yeltsin, had developed a widely known reputation for being drunk in public. Putin presented himself as the presidential alternative for stable, competent governance. The Second Chechen War was neither short nor was it easy, dragging on for nearly a decade with a brutal insurgency phase. But the initial military operations from 1999 to 2000 looked like victory to the Russian public. Russian forces retook Grozny, the Chechen capital, by February 2000. The human cost was staggering, with estimates claiming as many as 25,000 civilians died in the first year alone. But Russian media focused exclusively on military victories and Putin's strong leadership. His approval ratings soared from 31% in August 1999 to 84% by January 2000, just in time to assume the presidency after outgoing President Boris Yeltsin resigned and appointed Putin as his successor. Through this, Putin demonstrated that he had a clear understanding of the Russian people's wants and concerns. The country has lived through repeated foreign invasions that left deep scars on the national psyche for centuries, from the Mongols to Napoleon to Hitler, all of which were remembered as an existential threat to survival. Over the centuries, this has created what historians call the Fortress Russia mentality. Enemies surround us, the larger world is hostile, and only strong leadership can ensure survival. When Putin describes conflicts as struggles against Western aggression, it activates these deep fears about foreign enemies at the gates. He would use variations of this repeatedly throughout his career. When his approval sagged to 61% after 2011 protests over supposed election fraud, Putin needed another crisis. The 2014 Crimea annexation provided the perfect opportunity. His ratings jumped from 61% to 86% practically overnight, reaching 89% by June of 2015, his highest ever. Even economic disasters became opportunities. When the 2008 global financial crisis hammered Russia, the stock market losing nearly 2/3 of its value and GDP taking a significant hit, Putin deflected responsibility onto Western capitalism. Instead of admitting domestic policy failures, of which there were many, he positioned Russia as the victim and used the crisis to justify greater state control over the economy. Putin's greatest political manipulation wasn't about converting external crises into opportunities, though. It was about weaponizing Russia's own cultural identity to make any opposition seem fundamentally treasonous. Putin's greatest political manipulation wasn't about economics or foreign policy, though. It was rather how he weaponized Russia's social attitudes into a tool for delegitimizing any opposition as fundamentally anti-Russian, regardless of its origins. The shift was calculated and cynical. Putin realized that economic modernization alone wouldn't guarantee that his power would last. What he needed was to make political opposition, any opposition, seem like cultural treason. This would, of course, take work, and the genius was in how he bundled his rule with Russian identity. Early in his presidency, Putin positioned himself as the pragmatic modernizer. He welcomed foreign investment, pushed for WTO membership, and even made reforms to join the Council of Europe. But around 2004, something shifted. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine showed to him, much like the fall of the Berlin Wall, an event that shook him to his core, that popular movements could topple Moscow-friendly governments. He began constructing a new political formula. You could have his form of government, or you could have chaos and Western domination. There just wasn't a middle ground. To understand how this worked, we need to address where public opinion stood in Russia at the time and where it is today. This is a far more socially conservative country than those in Western Europe, a trend which was independent of Putin. He didn't create this phenomenon, but he certainly exploited it. The return to prominence of the Russian Orthodox Church became a key tool in this project. After decades of repression, oftentimes brutally, particularly under the Stalinist years, the church had something of a renewal after the fall of the USSR. Given the disbanding of one of the world's largest superpowers and the total collapse of state institutions and the certainties they provided, there was a vacuum for authority throughout society for what an independent Russia could be. The church filled this for many Russians, giving them a sense of meaning and invoking an authority that claimed to go beyond this world, not something that could collapse if poorly governed. By 2007, 72% of Russians identified as Orthodox, which was up from 31% in 1992. While undoubtedly partially due to the persecution that the church went through under Soviet rule subsiding after its collapse, this nevertheless shows a move of Russians seeking some form of authority and meaning in tradition. Putin recognized that he could hijack this revival for his own political goals. The man who served the officially atheist USSR for decades as a KGB officer suddenly presented himself as a public champion of orthodoxy. The church reciprocated these gestures. Patriarch Kirill, who became the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in 2009, famously called Putin's rule a miracle of God. But the real innovation wasn't just embracing conservatism, it was making any alternative seem to be, by definition, foreign. For a nation that has long seen itself as isolated from the West and suspicious of outside interference, such a label resonated domestically in a way Western audiences may have a hard time understanding. In 2012, Russia passed a foreign agents law that required NGOs receiving foreign funding to register with the stigmatized label of foreign agent. By 2025, over 900 organizations had received such a label, including Memorial, Russia's Nobel Prize-winning human rights group that documented Soviet war crimes. The message was clear: civil society opposition to the government is foreign infiltration. At the same time, LGBT rights became a useful wedge issue in this broader strategy. In 2013, Russia's parliament, the Duma, passed the now infamous gay propaganda law, banning what it described as, quote, promotion of non-traditional sexual relations to minors. The law polled at 88% support domestically, though it's worth noting that this was a period when most Russians had limited exposure to alternative viewpoints on the issue and thus bought more easily into the idea that such movements were actually foreign threats to Russian social cohesion. Now, a lot more nuance is needed here. Russia, along with every other country, has LGBT citizens. Moscow itself had thriving gay clubs in the 90s and numerous domestic LGBT advocacy groups that had nothing to do with Western funding. But Putin successfully reframed these domestic movements as foreign contamination, making support for any minority rights seem like a betrayal of Russian identity. This allowed Putin to reframe the entire political spectrum. The opposition wasn't offering different economic policies or governance models. They were offering, according to him, a whole-scale westernization that was neither welcome nor needed for the well-being of Russia. To take it from him directly, quote, we see how many Euro-Atlantic countries have taken the path of rejecting their roots, including Christian values. This is the path to degradation. This fusion had devastating effectiveness. When protesters filled Moscow streets in 2011 and 2012 demanding fair elections, state media didn't focus on their actual demands, ending corruption, real political competition, economic reform. Instead, they zoomed in on any rainbow flags in the crowd and highlighted which organizers had received Western grants. The message was clear: these aren't real Russians with legitimate grievances, they're agents of Western cultural imperialism. Consider how this trapped even sophisticated opposition figures. Alexei Navalny, nobody's idea of a liberal, had to spend years walking back earlier nationalist statements while simultaneously trying not to alienate socially conservative Russians. Early in his career, he'd marched with nationalists and made inflammatory statements about immigrants. When asked about LGBT rights, he'd give tortured non-answers about letting regions decide. The opposition couldn't articulate a vision that was both reformist and recognizably Russian because Putin had made those categories mutually exclusive. But here's the crucial part, and it often gets missed. This fusion would prove most valuable when Putin began dismantling the same economic achievements that built his popularity. Putin chose confrontation over continued modernization. The annexation of Crimea that March marked a major pivot, trading economic development for nationalist geopolitical confrontation with the West. We can only speculate what the country would look like today if it made a different choice, but it would doubtlessly have many more Russian citizens still alive and a far more prosperous economy. Think about the trajectory here. Putin rose to power promising prosperity through modernization and reform, which would to some extent integrate Russia into the global economy. He delivered for a decade. Russia's GDP grew 72% in his first 8 years. Then, facing the limits of his economic model and threats to his political control, he began to double down on the strongman approach at the expense of his initial reforms. The Crimea annexation in 2014 triggered sanctions that cut Russia off from Western technology and investment. The 2022 invasion completed the transformation, turning Russia back into the isolated economy mold from which it had been trying to escape. While some domestically were more optimistic about where this would take the country economically, the writing was on the wall for others. Russian central bank governor Elvira Nabiullina reportedly offered her resignation after the invasion was launched, fearing that the fallout would undo the work that she had spent her career doing. Even after the international fallout from his 2014 invasion of Crimea, which was admittedly not as strong as it could have been, Russians felt empowered. By the time the 2022 invasion was launched, the country expressed broad yet tepid support for the operation. Many had come to trust Putin's judgment based on previous conflicts, which, despite occasionally taking longer than originally anticipated, had ultimately been portrayed as successes in Russian media. The Second Chechen War dragged on for nearly a decade, for instance, but after the early days were portrayed as a total victory, Russians remained quite supportive. Tapping into the nationalist vein of the country has paid off in droves for him, even with groups who were otherwise more cool to his presidency. According to the Levada Center, more than 2/3 of Russians aged 18 to 24 describe themselves as patriots, which is much higher than many other countries in Europe, a figure that actually increased during the war despite their declining support for Putin personally. This all came at enormous cost. By fusing his personal power with cultural battles, Putin made it increasingly politically unpopular for the domestic opposition to advocate any type of reform, even if they maintained a more socially conservative approach. Much of Eastern and Central Europe tells the story of what could have been achieved had this gone down differently. Poland remains a relatively conservative country while tripling its GDP through integration with the EU. South Korea modernized dramatically after the lifting of martial law in 1987 while preserving a relatively traditional culture, proving that economic development and democratization don't require either a massive social revolution or authoritarian governance. Western observers often miss this completely. They see Russian opposition figures and assume they must all be liberal in the Western sense. This misreading actually helps Putin by reinforcing his narrative. Many Russians who oppose Putin do not do so because they want to fully embrace the political and cultural systems of Western Europe and the United States, but because they want a competent, less corrupt, more prosperous Russia. But in Putin's binary world, there's no political space for either. Putins Support isn't a monolith. It's a complex coalition held together by different hopes and fears. Understanding who backs him and why they do reveals how he has remained this popular for so long, while also exposing the fragile position he finds himself in today. Poll numbers show that Putin has an 86% approval rating, which can be a little bit misleading without further analysis, as that support isn't evenly spread throughout society. But before diving into those demographic patterns, it's worth addressing just how much we can trust these numbers. We've all seen the numbers out of some of these authoritarian states. Last year, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko won with 81% of the vote amid widespread reports of ballot stuffing. In 2014, Syria's Bashar al-Assad took 92%. Saddam Hussein didn't even bother trying, and instead of having a puppet opposition candidate, ran a yes-no referendum on his continued presidency, in which he, of course, received a 100% yes vote. Nobody voted against it. Russia's different. While we can't exactly say their elections don't have fraud, and certainly can say there is considerable repression of the opposition, institutes like the Levada Center have been able to conduct independent, generally reliable polling. while independent researchers who attempt to correct for fear-based lying by using anonymous polling techniques found Putins support might be inflated by 5 to 10%, a majority still appears to support him, and the data Levada puts out is generally credible. What Levada does show us is that there are stark demographic patterns running throughout Putin's support, which tell stories about generational experience, geographic isolation, and fundamentally different relations with information and authority. The starkest divide runs along generational lines, and for a good reason. Your relation with Putin largely depends on how you remember Russia before the collapse of the USSR, or if you remember it at all. Those who are over 55 form his most reliable base of support, with approval ratings consistently above 70% and at times as high as the mid-80s. These Russians, called Soviet Memory Generation, lived through genuine superpower status when they were on par with Washington. The Soviet economy had serious chronic problems, don't get us wrong, and included periods of widespread famine. Yet, for those looking back at it, some selectively remember the rosier parts, when the USSR was a world leader. What they're really nostalgic for isn't Soviet reality, it's the feeling of mattering on the world stage. For this generation, Putin's expansionist policies abroad are a return to what they remember as the glory days. When they see Russian forces exerting Moscow's influence abroad, from Chechnya to Georgia, much of their support reflects nostalgia for when Russia was a major global power. Research shows that 80% of Russians felt their country was a superpower again following the Crimea invasion. More importantly, they remember the chaos of the 1990s vividly. For them, Putin isn't just president, he's the man who saved Russia from dissolution. That gratitude runs deep and has proven remarkably durable even as current policies fail. The polar opposite of this is the so-called Putin generation, made up of Russians under 35 or so. They earn this name because for most of their adult life, and increasingly all of their lives, Putin has been at the center of Russian politics. Unlike the preceding generations, though, they have little to no memory of the Soviet Union. While some have doubtlessly been influenced by the talk of their parents and grandparents, that's all it is to them, is just talk. For as far back as they can remember, their Russia has always been Putin's Russia. Rather than comparing their country to the chaos of the 90s or the might of the Soviet Union, they compare it to the other countries around them. And by that standard, Russia looks increasingly isolated and behind the times. Yet a tendency that Western observers frequently have that lead them to make repeated mistakes in analyzing the country is assuming that this sort of phenomenon will play out exactly the way it has over the last several decades in their homes, with young generations taking a much more liberal, cosmopolitan approach to how they see the world. But this isn't the case in Russia. Young Russians have shown a defiant trend of being very patriotic while not expressing much approval for Putin's presidency. They're proud to be Russian, but only 48% express confidence in Putin personally. This creates a remarkable 34-point gap between national pride and leader approval, far larger than what we see in Western democracies and far more nationalistic as well. Both young Americans and Brits have seen sharply downward trends in patriotism. Only 41% of young Americans are proud to be American, and a similar number of Brits are proud to be British. Young Russians have maintained strong national identity while also being far more critical of Putin personally, exactly the distinction he tried to erase but never managed to achieve with this generation. The urban-rural divide in Putin's support is equally dramatic. Moscow and St. Petersburg consistently show the lowest approval ratings, which typically hover in the 50s or low 60s. That's still quite high, although light years from where things stand in the rural areas and small cities. These places maintain approval ratings that typically are above 70% and may at times reach into the 80s or even the 90s. This geographic split reflects more than just access to information. In Russia's vast countryside and single-industry towns, the state remains the primary source of employment and services. A teacher in rural Siberia doesn't just work for a state school, she lives in state-subsidized housing, shops at state-supported stores, and watches state television for a window to the world. No matter how you look at it, though, it is hard to argue that Putin had anything other than considerable popularity throughout Russian society for much of his presidency. While it would wane at times, he was always able to bring it back to the same levels through one crisis or another. That is, until the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The February 2022 invasion of Ukraine was supposed to be just another step in Putin's crisis playbook: quick initial military victory, surge in patriotic support, strengthened political position. And to some extent it worked, but definitely not as planned and not indefinitely. Initially, the numbers looked promising for Moscow. Putin's approval jumped from 69% in January 2022 to 83% in March after the invasion, a solid 14-point jump. State television ran 24/7 coverage of the special military operation, presenting it as both a defensive action against expansionist NATO and Ukrainian Nazis. Despite failing to accomplish any of these original goals, and all signs indicating that this operation would take far longer than anyone had originally planned for, the rally around the flag effect seemed to nevertheless be working. Let's not forget, though, that support for Putin and support for the war are not the same thing, and they never were. Even in March 2022, at peak war fever, only 53% of Russians definitely supported the operation. Another 28% said they somewhat supported it, a lukewarm endorsement at best. Putin's personal approval at 83%, meaning a 30-point gap between believing in the leader and believing in the war. Again, this is not to say there was widespread opposition. Putin had the trust of many throughout the country, and a lot of Russians mostly went along with it. The support was a mile wide, but an inch deep. Enough to sustain the war politically, but not enough to generate the kind of zealous enthusiasm the Kremlin hoped for. For the first year, this support proved remarkably durable. Even as the 3-day special operation stretched into the first weeks, then months, even as Russian forces retreated from Kiev in a rather humiliating defeat, even as the Black Sea Fleet lost its flagship to a country without a navy, Putin's approval ratings remained above 80%. The September 2022 partial mobilization caused some unrest domestically, sure, but it proved more to be an international embarrassment than a truly domestic crisis. His approval rating dipped to 77%, still a level high enough that many world leaders would be real envious. So why did the predictions of Putin's imminent downfall keep failing? Well, that's because they misunderstood what held his regime together in the first place. It wasn't just fear, propaganda, or repression, although those doubtlessly played some role. The deeper truth that was, by all appearances, Russia had internalized Putin's political fusion. Even those who privately opposed the war couldn't actively articulate it out of fear of sounding anti-Russian. Take the case of Tomaty, for instance, a famous Russian rapper who had previously been at odds with Putin's presidency. After the invasion, though, he posted what would become a viral message about feeling the need to support your country in wartime, no matter if it's for a just cause or not, going so far as to say that he preferred to imagine that Russia was actually under threat from NATO to justify it all. And he was hardly alone in feeling this way. The formula that trapped opposition now trapped ordinary citizens. You could support Russia's war, or you could side with the West against your own country. The possibility of being a patriotic Russian who opposed the war, a position held by millions in private, had been erased from public discourse. But by late 2024, the formula that had sustained Putin for over 2 decades began breaking down, not from any single traumatic event, but from the slow accumulation of costs that could no longer be hidden or explained away. The crisis does present cracks that would have been unimaginable even a few years ago. Now that we're in 2025, these cracks have become chasms. According to the same Levanta Center polling from earlier this year, Russians under the age of 30 now express dwindling support for the ongoing special military operation. Geography also plays a role here, with cities being far less supportive and at times more actively hostile to the war effort. Even among Putin's largest base of support, older Russians, patience is running thin amidst the never-ending carnage of war. The scale of this conflict is staggering and almost impossible to overstate. With total casualties, killed, wounded and missing, increasing by over 1,000 daily, according to Western intelligence estimates, Russia is simply losing men faster than it can replace them. According to Ukrainian officials, these numbers are even more grim. Figures put the average number of daily Russian casualties at 1,286. Now, as we've covered previously on this channel, Moscow has been able to maintain more or less levels of recruitment needed through massive financial incentives, often focusing on poorer areas of the country. Sign-up bonuses that started at 200,000 rubles now exceed 5 million rubles in some regions just for enlisting. The monthly salaries are, for most Russians, the most lucrative career prospect that they can pursue. This approach has held the line, both in terms of luring an ongoing stream of recruits and placating domestic unrest with extremely generous death benefits. But even this has its limits, and it appears to be reaching that point right now. Military recruitment fell by 65% in the first quarter of 2025 compared to 2023, and by over 80% in Moscow. The pool of those enlisting for purely patriotic reasons has been exhausted. Nobody has sat on the sidelines only to decide that today is the day that they're going to risk laying down their life for Mother Russia. In order to keep fueling his war machine, Putin has been enlisting growing numbers of North Korean soldiers. The elite consensus that sustained Putin is also fracturing at unprecedented speed. July 2025 alone saw a cascade of suspicious deaths and arrests that shocked even cynical Moscow observers. Transport Minister Roman Stravoit's apparent suicide on July 8th followed a pattern. Officials who questioned resource allegations of the war suddenly dying. Oligarch Konstantin Strukov's arrest while attempting to flee Turkey with 200 billion rubles in assets sent a clear message. Even decades of loyalty no longer guarantee safety. Since January 2025, 7 senior officials and 3 oligarchs have died under mysterious circumstances. The impatience with the war and with it Putin's governance itself has not been limited to the home front. US President Donald Trump, who long campaigns on the promise to have the war in Ukraine wrapped up before even taking office, has openly grown exasperated with Putin's unwillingness to negotiate in good faith. In a rather major reversal from his previous stance, Trump has been taking a harder line against Moscow. This has to be seen as nothing other than a major geopolitical loss for Putin, with whom Trump has controversially yet definitely expressed affinity for. His new administration entered the year eager to negotiate a deal that allegedly would have recognized several concessions from Kiev to Moscow in exchange for an international security corridor policed by a coalition of European soldiers, ensuring that no further violence would take place against Ukraine. The economic situation is closing in around him. That massive military spending that initially cushioned the impact of the war is not sustainable, and cracks are beginning to show. Defense spending for 2025 consumes up 41% of the federal budget, up from 14% in 2021. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, you name it, is all being sacrificed to feed a war machine that pretty clearly cannot deliver a victory. Even more tellingly, the state has begun to hide more and more statistics behind classified state secrets provisions. In January of this year, Putin signed a law making all military casualties state secrets. Regional governments must conduct military funerals at night, which is a sharp contrast to 2014, when soldiers who died taking Crimea were publicly honored as heroes. The gap between war support and Putin's approval has only widened. January 2025's polling data shows Putin maintaining 75% approval, yet only 41% of Russians now definitely support continuing the conflict in Ukraine. Among under 30s, that number drops to just 19%. Even more tellingly, when asked in anonymous online polls, which should be viewed with a bit more skepticism in terms of overall reliability, whether Russia should accept territorial losses to end the war, 34% now said yes. While far short of the majority, that's still a level that would have been previously unthinkable even a year ago. Russia has been able to hold off the worst impacts of this war from hitting its homeland and economy too hard for longer than most would have thought possible. Some of the masterminds of these plans, though, they've been signaling that the system is reaching a breaking point. Elvira Nabiulina last fall warned that Russia's overheated war economy was, quote, running on empty. Since then, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have died. The labor shortage she was referring to has then developed into a crisis and won't get better while the war rages on. For now, Putin remains what he's been for 25 years, the irreplaceable man in Russian politics. That's not strength, it is the most dangerous weakness of all, because in systems where everything depends on one man, when that one man finally falls, everything can fall with him. For 25 years, Putin has maintained a political formula that has largely defied gravity. Every crisis became an opportunity, every setback proof of his necessity, every foreign condemnation evidence of his strength on the global stage. Even today, with Russia bleeding men at a staggering rate, with the economy cannibalizing itself, and with former allies fleeing or dying mysteriously, Putin's approval remains higher than most democratic leaders could dream of. But the war that Putin launched in the hopes of shoring up his support is starting to cut into the very foundations of his political capital. Russia cannot sustain the necessary recruitment figures for this battle indefinitely, and we are seeing reality begin to set in. The labor shortage crisis, with unemployment at a record low, reveals an economy stretched beyond its limits. This increasingly perilous situation undermines the core tenets that built his popularity in the first place. Ironically, it is Putin who demonstrated Russia's increasing dependence on foreign powers through his drafting of North Korean soldiers, exactly the kind of foreign dependence that his entire political brand hand, was built on rejecting, with every passing day that the war drags on, the economic recovery that he spent years solidifying continues to unravel. The same formula that generated authentic popular support over decades is now systematically destroying the conditions that made that support possible. Putin's approval ratings may remain high for now, but they reflect a complex reality of genuine gratitude mixed with resignation, authentic patriotism combined with fear of speaking out, pride in Russian strength alongside private doubts about the current direction. The numbers capture support, but not enthusiasm, acceptance, but not hope. To borrow a phrase, bankruptcy has been variously described as a process that occurs slowly and then all at once. Putin's political formula, as impressive as it has been, may very soon discover this firsthand. Thank you for watching.